So European leaders, including Ukraine's President Zelenskyy, headed to the White House today. This follows Friday's Alaska summit between President Trump and Russian President Putin. Joining us right now is Matt Whitaker. He's U.S. ambassador to NATO. Good morning to you. Let's start with just the basics. How do you think Friday's meeting went, and what do you think it portends for today?
Well, good to be with you. I think there's a couple things we need to consider. One is that this is a process. Obviously, everyone wants the fighting to end. President Trump is committed to saving the tens of thousands of people that are dying every single week on the battlefield. But at the same time, it's going to take both sides to come together and to have an agreement. And President Trump is seeing if there is an ability to negotiate, mediate, quite frankly, a resolution to the war. And I think Secretary Rubio said it best yesterday. He said that there was progress made, that they felt there was enough progress to take it to the next step, which is this meeting today. And we'll see how the European leaders, together with President Zelenskyy, respond to what was proposed by President Putin.
Mr. Ambassador, the thing that I think that some people can't figure out is, the meeting was cut short, or at least shorter than people had anticipated. And some people, you could take it two ways. You either everything worked out perfectly, super quickly, and so they ended the meeting quickly and said, let's stop wasting time, we're just going to go to it, or it didn't work out the way it was supposed to. Which was it?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, we wouldn't be taking this next step if it didn't go as hoped. I mean, obviously, I think all indications that progress was made, that there is a proposal that has come from Russia that was briefed on the plane ride back by President Trump to both President Zelenskyy and the European leaders. And now they're convening today to meet about it and to talk about it and to find out if there's a counter proposal, if there is something to work with here. I mean, again, it's a process. And I think President Trump has been pretty clear that he is trying to create the conditions to bring not only Russia to the table, and I think he's the only one that could bring Russia to the table, but also see if there's a deal to be made. And that's,
what do you make of the next step? Look, the critique is no ceasefire, that was supposed to be a precondition going into the meeting that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. It sounds to me like ultimately Ukraine's going to give up Crimea and Putin's going to get what he wants in terms of Ukraine not becoming part of NATO. Then you say to yourself, well, why does Putin not want him to become part of NATO? Because maybe he wants to keep going later. What do you think of that?
Well, as you know, NATO is the strongest military alliance ever on the planet. So, I mean, obviously, that is a strong incentive, and Ukraine does want to be in NATO. All 32 members would have to agree to that ascension if that were to happen. But, what's very clear that came out of Friday is that there is something here to work with. Ukraine's going to have to agree to any deal. It's not going to be a great deal for either side. Russia is not going to get everything they want. Ukraine's not going to get everything they want. But at the same time, we're going to end the tens of thousands of soldiers and, quite frankly, civilians that are dying every week in Ukraine. I mean, it is just catastrophic, the humanity. And so I think, we have to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And at some point in time, see if a deal can be had. And I think that's what President Trump has done. I mean, he is a peacemaker. He's made 6 peace deals, most recently between Thailand and Cambodia. And so plus Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's a series of peace deals that he concluded, brought to the finish line. And I think that gives him the space here to see if a deal can be made in this conflict.
Do you think Ukraine should become part of NATO?
Well, I think it takes all 32 members. We haven't taken the sense of the 32 members as to whether Ukraine should be part of NATO. Obviously, there is a process. They're not part of the EU either. And that process, they would have to meet certain things, including corruption has to be rooted out, and other political issues have to be considered. But, that obviously is a question for another day. And ultimately, I'm President Trump's representative at NATO. And so the decision of whether or not the United States supports that is up to President Trump.
Clearly, Europe has been much more supportive of Ukraine and Zelenskyy in many ways, or in some ways, I don't want to say more supportive, because you could argue we've been more supportive in terms of just total dollars. But there is a sense, if you read some of the newspapers in Europe, for example, about their frustration with the United States in these circumstances, and think that we are leaving Zelenskyy out there and putting him in a corner. Do you agree with that?
I don't. That is not the current situation on the ground. I obviously live and work in Europe currently, even though I'm in Washington, D.C. for these meetings today. I really think that the Europeans know that the United States has to be at the table. They have begged us not to walk away. That is their biggest concern, is that President Trump walks away from this peace process. And the United States is the only country, including President Trump's the only person that can bring Vladimir Putin to the table, that has the cards to play to continue to exert leverage. Obviously the sanctions and tariffs on India were significant and were felt. And, those types of things can continue to be rolled out if there is an unwillingness to continue down the path to peace. But I just think the Europeans know that the United States is their best ally, their best friend. We have great relationships within NATO and within Europe. And so they know the United States needs to be at the table, and they want us there.
Mr. Ambassador, some of the individuals that, I don't know what you'd characterize them as, maybe almost Putin enablers or a certain fringe element of, I guess it's even the Republican Party, that said that the reason Putin can say he was justified in the initial move on Ukraine was because he was concerned that NATO would be right on his doorstep, and that should have never been even broached. And so if there is a security guarantee that's not NATO, but it's like NATO light or something, how do you thread that needle to where it's not NATO, which Putin definitely doesn't want, but it still essentially does the same thing as the United States guaranteeing the Ukrainian security? I don't know how you do. You call it something different, but it's the same thing?
Well, ultimately, it's an alliance. It's a coalition is what NATO is, and anything that would be a security guarantee for Ukraine would be some form of a coalition or an alliance for that purpose, and then you would, draft up some sort of a governing document. I think we're a long way from hanging some flesh on that. There's been a coalition of the willing that has been meeting, led by the UK and Germany, and I've sat in some of those meetings because many of them have been at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and certainly there is a desire to make sure that when this war ends, when there is a peace, that it's a lasting peace, an enduring peace. And the only way they can do that is to make sure that Russia doesn't continue to press on the offensive ever again. And the only way you do that is make sure that Ukraine is very strong. Obviously, they've done an admirable, brave job defending themselves and fighting. But at the same time, they're facing just a war machine in Russia, and a bigger economy, a bigger population, and the economics and the numbers are just difficult long term if you really play it out over a decade, which nobody wants this to continue. And so, security guarantees, participation of Europe, a bearing of the burden of Europe, which is what we started when we got together in The Hague a couple months ago, and Europe and Canada committed to 5% GDP for their collective defense and their individual defense. And I think that set the framework and the path to what could happen in Ukraine with Ukraine's participation. But I think right now it's very clear that any security guarantee would be outside of the NATO security framework.
Ambassador, you're completely right. I think those are all the relevant questions and points, but the big issue is, how do we trust Putin, who has made these promises in the past? He was the aggressor in this position. He signed all of these truces, including the Ukraine sovereignty truce back in 1994 and the one for Crimea in 2014. Same person. He goes back on his word time and time again, and I think that's why we probably need something with a lot of teeth to protect whatever is agreed to.
I think there's no doubt about that. Obviously, President Reagan said it best. We trust but verify. And right. In this case, it's going to have to make sure that Ukraine is strong enough, together with this coalition of the willing and an Article 5-like commitment from Europe to be there on the ground and to protect Europe together with the Ukrainians. And that's, I think, what's going to be formed up here.